My name is Daniel Ashford, and 3 years ago I bought what I thought was my forever home. 12 acres of quiet countryside, a renovated farmhouse, a long gravel driveway lined with maple trees, and exactly one neighbor close enough to matter. Her name was Sandra Whitlock, though within a month everyone on the road had started calling her something else behind her back. You already know what. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the ending only makes sense once you understand just how far one woman was willing to go to control a strip of land that was never hers to control. This is the story of how my neighbor built an actual guard shack, wood frame, shingled roof, a little sliding window like a toll booth, in the middle of what she believed was a private road, just to block my access to my own home. And how, in the end, a stack of dusty county records turned the entire situation upside down. Let's start at the beginning. The move-in. When my wife Claire and I first toured the farmhouse, our realtor mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the driveway leading up to the house crossed a shared access road. She said it like it was nothing. Plenty of rural properties work that way. 2 or 3 homes splitting a gravel road that eventually forks off to each individual driveway. It seemed simple enough. We closed on the house in the spring, moved our furniture in over a long weekend, and for the first 2 weeks, everything was peaceful. Then Sandra introduced herself. She showed up unannounced on a Tuesday evening, walked straight up our porch steps without waiting to be invited, and told us, not asked, told us, that the road out front was her family's road and that she'd allowed the previous owners to use it as a courtesy. She said she expected the same courtesy going forward, meaning we were to drive slowly, never park equipment near the fork, and absolutely never let contractors block her turnaround. I remember looking at Claire after Sandra left and both of us just kind of laughing it off. New neighbor jitters, we figured. Every neighborhood has one person who's a little territorial. We had no idea what we were actually dealing with. The small stuff. Looking back, the first 6 months were a slow drip of small incidents, each one easy to dismiss on its own, but together they painted a pretty clear picture. Sandra complained about our moving truck. She complained about the gravel delivery for our new driveway extension. She left a note on our mailbox, an actual handwritten note, informing us that our porch light was trespassing onto her field of vision at night. She called the county about a fence post that was supposedly 6 inches over what she believed was the property line, even though our survey clearly showed otherwise. At one point she planted a row of thorny bushes directly along the section of road nearest our driveway entrance, which made it nearly impossible for 2 vehicles to pass each other without one pulling onto the grass. When I gently brought this up, she told me the bushes were for privacy and that if my truck was too wide for the road, that was my problem to solve, not hers. I tried to be a good neighbor. I really did. I brought over a pie when we moved in. I offered to split the cost of regrading the road after a bad storm washed out part of it. She refused, saying she'd rather handle her own property herself. That phrase, her own property, should have been the first real red flag, because at that point I had genuinely never looked into who actually owned the road beneath our tires. There was also the mailbox incident, which Claire still brings up whenever this story comes up at dinner parties. Our mailbox sat at the very start of the shared road, right where it met the county highway, and one afternoon we came home to find it had been moved nearly 10 feet down the shoulder, sitting crookedly in the grass like someone had yanked it out of the ground and dropped it somewhere else entirely. When I asked Sandra if she'd seen anything, she told me, without a hint of embarrassment, that she'd relocated it herself because it was interfering with her sightline when she backed her car out of her own driveway. I pointed out that the mailbox had been in that exact spot since before either of us owned our homes. She shrugged and said some things just needed updating. Then there was the matter of the community mailer. Our little stretch of road had an informal group chat that a few of the older residents used to share information, storm warnings, road conditions, the occasional lost dog. Sandra was an active member of that chat, and more than once she used it to post vague, pointed messages about certain new residents who didn't understand rural etiquette, never naming us directly, but leaving little doubt about who she meant. Walter, our older neighbor down the road, later admitted he found the whole thing exhausting, since Sandra had been doing some version of this with nearly every new family who'd moved onto the road over the past decade. Looking back, I think the reason none of it ever escalated into a real confrontation during those first several months was simple exhaustion. Claire and I were both working full-time, settling into a new house, learning the rhythms of rural life for the first time. Every single complaint from Sandra felt like a minor annoyance rather than a pattern, and it's only in hindsight, once you lay them all out together, that you can see how deliberately she was staking her claim over something that was never entirely hers to claim in the first place. Escalation. Things took a sharper turn about a year in, when I started working from home more often and began receiving regular deliveries and client visits. Sandra apparently decided this counted as commercial traffic on her road, which she insisted, again with zero evidence, was governed by rules only she seemed to know. She started parking her own car at odd angles near the fork, just enough to force incoming vehicles to slow to a crawl. She'd stand on her porch and watch, arms crossed, whenever a delivery van came through. Once, she flagged down a UPS driver and lectured him for nearly 10 minutes about unauthorized use of a private easement, which left the poor guy so rattled he asked me directly if he was doing something wrong. I finally decided to look into the actual paperwork. I called the title company that had handled our closing and asked for a copy of the recorded easement agreement, assuming there had to be one somewhere, some official document laying out who owned what and who had the right to use the road. Sandra, on the other hand, acted as though she had ironclad proof of exclusive ownership, even though, as I'd later discover, she'd never actually pulled her own deed to check. The guard shack. Then came the day that changed everything. I remember it was a Saturday morning in early October. I was heading out to grab supplies for a weekend project when I turned onto the road and found something completely blocking my path. A shack. Not a shed. Not a temporary barricade. An actual small wooden structure, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, complete with a shingled roof, a little sliding plexiglass window, and a hand-painted sign reading "Private Road, Check-in Required." It sat squarely in the middle of the gravel, positioned in such a way that there was no room to drive around it without cutting through Sandra's newly planted flower bed. I sat in my truck for a solid 30 seconds just staring at it, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me it was a prank. Instead, the little sliding window creaked open, and there was Sandra, sitting inside on a folding chair with a clipboard in her lap like she was running a toll booth on a private toll road. "Name and purpose of visit," she said, completely straight-faced. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what exactly she thought she was doing. She explained, with total confidence, that after consulting with a friend who used to work in real estate, she determined that the road was entirely on her property, and that from that point forward, anyone wanting to use it, myself included, apparently, would need to check in through her new guard station. I told her this was insane, that I owned the house at the end of that exact road and had every legal right to access it. She said, and I quote, "That's what everyone thinks until they read the fine print." Then she slid the little window shut. I had to back my truck all the way down the road and take the long way around through a neighboring farmer's field just to get into town that day. Digging into the records. That night, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table and made a decision. We weren't going to argue with Sandra anymore. We were going to find out, once and for all, exactly who owned what. The next morning, I drove down to the county recorder's office and requested every document tied to our parcel and the surrounding parcels going back as far as they had records. The clerk, a patient older woman named Patricia, pulled up decades of plat maps, deed transfers, and old subdivision filings. It took hours, but slowly a picture began to form. The original farmland in our area had been split off in the 1960s by a single landowner who sold off individual lots to different buyers, while retaining ownership of the access road connecting them as a separate, undivided parcel. That landowner never sold the road itself. Instead, when he passed away decades later, the road parcel was distributed through his estate, and it turned out it had been split unevenly among his heirs, with the largest single share, just over half, ending up folded into the estate that eventually became our 12 acres when we purchased the property. In plain terms, my property didn't just have a right to use the road. My property owned the majority controlling interest in the road itself, including the exact stretch of gravel where Sandra had built her little wooden guard shack. I sat in that recorder's office for a long moment just reading the document over and over, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding something. Patricia, sensing my shock, pulled up a certified copy and printed it for me on the spot. She also showed me something I hadn't even thought to ask about, a handwritten margin note on one of the older filings, dated back to the original 1960s landowner himself. In it, he'd left instructions to his estate executor stating that the access road should always remain open to all lot owners along its length, regardless of individual parcel shares. It wasn't binding language in the way a modern easement clause would be, Patricia explained, but it was recorded, dated, and consistent with everything else in the file. It painted a clear picture of a man who had never intended for any single heir or buyer to end up controlling the road outright. I asked Patricia how often people came in looking for this kind of information after a dispute had already started rather than before buying a property. She laughed, not unkindly, and said it was the majority of her walk-ins. Most people, she told me, only think to ask these questions once a fence goes up, a tree gets cut down, or in my case, once a guard shack appears out of nowhere. She said she wished more buyers requested a full title history before closing on a rural property, since so many of these shared access disputes could be avoided entirely with a single afternoon of research. I left the recorder's office with a thick folder of printed documents, my hands honestly a little shaky from the adrenaline of it all. I remember sitting in my truck in the parking lot for several minutes just processing what I'd found. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Sandra's place and slide the papers under her guard shack window. But I'd learned enough by that point to know that showing up emotional, without professional backing, would probably do more harm than good. Confirming everything. I wasn't about to walk over to Sandra's place waving a piece of paper and declaring victory. I've watched enough of these situations unfold to know that half-informed confidence gets people in trouble. So I hired a local real estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renee Castillo, who specialized in property and easement disputes. Renee reviewed everything I'd gathered and, after running her own title search, confirmed what the recorder's office had shown me. Not only did our property hold majority ownership of the road parcel, but the original 1960 subdivision agreement had also granted every lot along that road a permanent, non-revocable right of access, meaning even the minority owners couldn't legally block passage. Sandra's deed, when Renee pulled it, showed she owned a small sliver of the road parcel too, just enough that she likely believed, in some genuinely confused way, that it was entirely hers. She had apparently never had a proper survey done and had simply assumed, based on where her property lines seemed to run, that the whole road belonged to her family. Renee explained that regardless of her confusion, what Sandra had done, obstructing a road in which multiple parties held recorded rights, was a legitimate legal violation. Blocking an easement, especially with a permanent structure, could expose her to real consequences, both civil and potentially involving the county itself, since emergency vehicle access was also part of the original agreement. The warning. Renee drafted a formal letter. It laid out, point by point, the ownership history, our majority interest in the road, the non-revocable access rights, and a clear demand that the guard shack be removed within 14 days or we would pursue an injunction along with damages for the obstruction. I could have just shown up and confronted Sandra myself, but Renee advised against it. Let the paperwork speak first, she told me. Emotional confrontations get remembered wrong. Certified letters don't. We sent the letter by certified mail. 3 days later, Sandra was standing at my front door, waving the envelope like it had personally offended her. "This is a mistake," she said. "My family has used this road for generations." I invited her in, more out of habit than anything else, and laid the actual documents out on the kitchen table. The original 1960s subdivision plat. The estate distribution records. The certified deed showing our majority ownership. The recorded easement rights. She stared at them for a long time without saying much. I could see her trying to find an angle, some argument that would make the paperwork say something other than what it clearly said. Eventually she just asked, quietly, "So the road was never really mine?" I told her the truth. A portion of it was hers, legally, on paper. But it had never been hers exclusively, and it had certainly never given her the right to block anyone else's access, especially not with a physical structure sitting in the middle of a shared right-of-way. The county gets involved. Sandra didn't remove the shack within the 14 days. I think, honestly, she was hoping the whole thing would just blow over, or that we'd lose our nerve. Instead, Renee filed the paperwork for an emergency injunction, citing both the ownership documentation and the fact that the obstruction posed a genuine safety issue, since it would have prevented an ambulance or fire truck from reaching our house in an emergency. That last point turned out to matter more than anything else. The county's code enforcement office, once notified, treated the obstruction as a fire code violation on top of the civil property dispute. An inspector came out, took photos, measured the width of the remaining passable road, and issued a citation on the spot for illegal obstruction of a recognized access easement. Sandra was given a mandatory removal order with a much shorter deadline than the one in our original letter, 72 hours, or the county would remove the structure themselves and bill her for the cost. I wasn't there when the shack finally came down, but a mutual neighbor, an older man named Walter who'd lived on the road even longer than Sandra, told me later that a small crew showed up with a truck and had the whole thing dismantled in under 2 hours. Apparently Sandra stood on her porch the entire time, arms crossed, watching in silence. The aftermath. I wish I could tell you that Sandra had some grand change of heart after that, that she came over with a pie of her own and apologized for the guard shack, the flagged-down delivery driver, the thorny bushes, all of it. That's not really how these things go in real life. What actually happened was quieter. She stopped confronting us directly. The bushes stayed, oddly enough, though she trimmed them back enough that 2 vehicles could finally pass. The porch watching stopped. For a while there was just this cold, uneasy silence between our 2 properties, the kind where you wave politely from a distance but never actually speak. About 4 months later, something shifted. I was out repairing a section of fence near the road when Sandra walked over, hands in her jacket pockets, and asked if I had a minute. She told me she'd finally hired her own surveyor, out of curiosity more than anything, and had confirmed everything Renee's paperwork had already shown. She admitted, somewhat stiffly, that she'd spent years assuming things about that road that simply weren't true, and that she was sorry for how she'd handled the situation, especially the shack. I won't pretend we became close friends after that. But something did change. She started acknowledging us when we passed on the road. She stopped treating every delivery truck like a trespasser. When a bad ice storm hit that winter and took down a tree across the shared section of gravel, she was the one who called me first thing in the morning so we could split the cost of having it cleared, something she never would have done a year earlier. Walter told me once, over coffee, that he thought the guard shack had actually been building in Sandra's mind for years before it ever got built in wood and shingles. He said she'd always talked about the road as though it were an extension of her own front yard, long before we ever moved in, and that a few of the previous owners of our house had quietly tolerated her attitude simply because they didn't want the hassle of pushing back. In a strange way, Walter said, we were the first people on that road willing to actually go through the effort of proving her wrong, and he thought that mattered more to her, in the end, than she'd ever admit out loud. The community group chat changed too, gradually. The pointed, vague messages stopped. A few months after the surveyor visit, Sandra actually posted something in the chat thanking certain neighbors for helping clear up a long-standing misunderstanding about the road, without naming us directly, but everyone on that road knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't a grand public apology, but for someone as stubborn as Sandra, it was about as close as we were ever going to get, and honestly, I respected it more than I expected to. What the records actually meant. I think about this story sometimes, and what strikes me most isn't the guard shack itself, as absurd as that was. It's how much conflict, stress, and wasted energy came from one simple gap. Nobody had actually looked at the real documents before making assumptions. Sandra assumed ownership because of where she thought the property lines fell. I assumed, for way too long, that a vague reference to a shared access corridor meant there was nothing more to learn. The truth was sitting in a filing cabinet at the county recorder's office the entire time, untouched for decades, waiting for someone to actually pull the thread. Once we did, everything became clear. The road wasn't a mystery. It wasn't some ambiguous gray area open to interpretation. It was a documented, recorded, legally defined piece of property, and the person who believed she had the most control over it actually had the least. Renee told me afterward that this kind of situation is far more common than people realize, especially in older rural subdivisions where original landowners split property decades ago and modern buyers simply inherit whatever assumptions came with the sale. Her advice, which I now pass along to anyone who'll listen, is simple. If you share any kind of access road, driveway, or easement with a neighbor, pull the actual recorded documents before you ever get into a dispute about it. Don't rely on hearsay, don't rely on what the previous owner told you, and definitely don't rely on what your neighbor insists is true. Go to the source. She also pointed out something that stuck with me long after the case wrapped up. In her years handling these disputes, she said the loudest, most confident party in a property argument is very often the one who has done the least amount of actual verification. Confidence, she explained, tends to fill the space where information is missing. Sandra never pulled her own deed because she never felt she needed to. She'd inherited a belief about the road the same way she'd inherited her house, passed down through years of assumption rather than a single afternoon spent reading paperwork. It wasn't malicious in the way I originally thought it was during those first frustrating months. It was closer to a kind of inherited certainty, the sort that calcifies over time until it feels indistinguishable from fact. I've thought about that a lot since, not just in terms of property lines, but in general. It's a strange, almost universal pattern. People build entire structures, sometimes literal ones like Sandra's guard shack, around beliefs they've simply never tested. And the moment those beliefs get challenged with real evidence, the whole structure tends to come down a lot faster than anyone expects, because it was never resting on solid ground to begin with. Where things stand now. It's been almost 2 years since the shack came down. The road is just a road again, gravel and maple leaves and the occasional pothole we all pitch in to fix. Sandra and I aren't close, but we are civil, and civil is honestly more than I ever expected after that first Tuesday evening when she walked up my porch steps uninvited and told me how things were going to be. Claire jokes sometimes that we should have kept a piece of the old guard shack as a souvenir, maybe mounted the little sliding window somewhere in the garage as a reminder of the year our neighbor tried to run a checkpoint through her flower bed. We didn't, but I still have the folder. Every document, every certified letter, every deed and plat map that Renee and I pulled together during those strange few months. I keep it in a drawer in my office, and every once in a while, when I'm reminded of how close things came to a much uglier confrontation, I pull it out and read through it again. It's a strange kind of comfort, knowing that somewhere in a dusty filing cabinet decades ago, a decision was made that would end up settling a dispute nobody involved could have predicted. A landowner splitting his estate among his heirs in a way that gave one lucky buyer, decades later, exactly the leverage needed to protect their own driveway. Claire and I have since gotten to know a few more of the neighbors along that road, people we barely spoke to during those first tense years because so much of our energy was tied up in the driveway dispute. There's an annual cookout now, something Walter started a couple of summers ago, and Sandra actually shows up, bringing a dessert and keeping mostly to herself, but present all the same. It's a small thing, but on a road that once had a guard shack sitting in the middle of it, small things like a shared cookout feel like real progress. The lesson. If there's one thing I want people to take from this story, it's this. Confidence is not the same as being correct. Sandra was never lying to us. Not really. She genuinely believed, with total sincerity, that the road belonged to her family. She built an entire wooden structure around that belief. She stood guard over it, quite literally, with a clipboard and a folding chair. But belief, no matter how sincere, doesn't override a recorded deed. It doesn't override decades-old subdivision agreements. It doesn't override the simple, unglamorous act of walking into a county office and asking a records clerk to pull the actual paperwork. We live in an age where it's easy to assume things, easy to repeat what we've always been told, easy to build entire arguments on foundations we've never actually tested. Sandra's guard shack, as ridiculous as it sounds, stood for months as a physical monument to exactly that kind of unchecked assumption. In the end, all it took to bring it down wasn't anger, or a shouting match, or a neighborhood feud escalating into something worse. It was patience, a records request, a good attorney, and a stack of paper that had been sitting quietly in a filing cabinet since before either of us was born. That's the story of how my neighbor built a guard shack to block my driveway, and how it turned out I owned the road all along. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you would have done in my position, and stick around, because I've got plenty more true neighbor stories where this one came from.